Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back on the program Ben Norton, who is a journalist and analyst whose work focuses primarily on geopolitics, international political economy, and U.S. foreign policy. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the independent news site Geopolitical Economy Report. And he lived and reported from Latin America for several years and is currently based in Beijing, China. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Ben, you've written quite a bit about this on your website, Geopolitical Economy Report, Ukraine, which has fallen from the corporate headlines. You know, no longer is Zelensky appearing at the opening of the New York Stock Exchange and being visited by Bon Jovi and things like that. But as is so often the case with news coverage, just because something isn't in the corporate media doesn't mean that it's not still taking up massive amounts of political and economic bandwidth. So, as you have reported on, you've got the likes of Boris Johnson, the former prime minister in the UK, saying that if Ukraine loses the war, it'll be the, quote, end of Western hegemony. Which, Boris, I would love to see that. You've also got Lindsey Graham calling Ukraine a gold mine that the U.S. can't afford to lose. And then you've got Ukraine using U.S. weapons to actually fire into Russia, a move earlier in June that easily could have pushed Russia to retaliate directly against the United States. So, Ben, with all these corporate cameras off, what is going on in the shadows in Ukraine? And what is the U.S. pushing and indeed paying towards vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, thanks, Eleanor. I think you provided the perfect context for all of these very important issues that are related to Ukraine. Because, of course, when we talk about the war in Ukraine, it's not just Russia and Ukraine. This is an international conflict. And really, the best way to understand it is it's a proxy war between Russia and NATO that's happening in Ukraine. And it's very tragic for the people of Ukraine. I mean, many thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives. Russians are losing their lives. And meanwhile, basically no one in the U.S. is losing their lives. There have been some U.S. mercenaries who have gone, but the U.S. keeps stoking these conflicts, pushing for more and more war, and the U.S. doesn't suffer. And meanwhile, you know, there are some people who criticize it because the U.S. is spending billions of dollars, and that's a rightful criticism. I mean, tens of billions of dollars in weapons and military assistance. But we should not forget that that is really, those are huge contracts that go to the U.S. military-industrial complex. So it's not like the U.S. is acting out of the kindness of its heart because it loves Ukrainians. Ukrainians are fighting and dying on behalf of the U.S. You know, the famous saying is the U.S. is willing to fight until the last Ukrainian, and that tens of billions of dollars of military assistance largely goes to U.S. weapons companies, big contractors, the Beltway bandits, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, BAE Systems, all of these big companies, right? They're the ones who are making so much money, huge profits. Their stocks are at record highs. And what we also see is that in Europe, we see countries remilitarizing. And this is an excuse that they're using for their own military industrial complexes. And at the same time, what we also see is that the vast majority of the world population is not on board with this Western war drive. This point is so critical. And we're talking about corporate media coverage. When there is coverage of the war in Ukraine, which of course is not as much as there used to be, but when there is, it's portrayed as though the entire world opposes Russia and sides with Ukraine. In reality, the vast majority of the world population is neutral and is definitely not allied with Ukraine. And we actually saw a very clear example of this on June 15th and June 16th in Switzerland. There was a conference held, which was hilariously called the Ukraine Peace Summit, but it was not a peace summit. It was a war summit, because in order to have a peace summit, if you actually want to have peace talks in a war, you have to invite both sides or all sides of the war to sit down and talk. Russia was not invited to the so-called peace summit. So in reality, it was the Western powers and a few allies. Now, 160 countries were invited, not Russia. 160 countries out of the 194 recognized by the UN. And of those 160, only 90 agreed to attend the conference. And of those 90, only 78 actually signed the final declaration. And over half of them were Europe. Basically, every single country in Europe, including very small countries like Andorra and Malta and Luxembourg They signed this agreement. And then the US, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and then a few allies, like the far-right regime in Argentina, led by this maniac, Javier Milei. You know, Israel they attended the conference and they signed it while they're carrying out horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, Netanyahu, there's an arrest warrant out for him from the International Criminal Court. Meanwhile, Israel was at this so-called peace summit that was not for peace because one side of the war was not invited. So that, I think, represents what is actually happening. I created a map at Geopolitical Economy Report looking at the vote, and you can see that it represented around a little less than 20% of the world population was at the summit. 80% was not represented, including China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil. Brazil attended the summit but did not sign the agreement. So what we're really seeing is that the Global South is not on board with this war. Instead, the Global South has been trying to broker peace. And in fact, China has played a key role in proposing numerous peace plans going back to 2023. And more recently, this May, China and Brazil jointly proposed a peace plan they had numerous different steps calling for an international peace conference in which Ukraine and Russia are allowed to participate, calling for an immediate end to hostilities, calling for the release of political prisoners, calling for prisoner exchange, calling for instance, no attacks on nuclear plants. You know, very important steps to try to bring an end to this war. And can you guess what the response of the Western powers was? Hell no, we are not going to support this peace proposal. The one that was made by China last year, the one that was recently made by China and Brazil. And there have been other peace proposals, for instance, by Mexico. Mexico has tried to negotiate peace with the Catholic Church and the Pope, and the US has not supported that peace agreement either. And if we even go back to the beginning of this new phase of the war that began in 2022, right after Russia sent its troops in February, in March and April, there were negotiations held that were sponsored by Turkey and also by Belarus. And at those peace talks, Russia made it very clear that it did want to sign a peace agreement. And we know this because the former German chancellor, that is their equivalent of the president, Gerhard Schröder, he said he was involved in the negotiations and he admitted this. And even Israel's former prime minister, Naftali Bennett, also admitted that Russia wanted to sign a peace agreement back in March of 2022. And it was the US and Boris Johnson, who is British prime minister, who sabotaged those agreements. And Boris Johnson, representing the US, of course, he has a little more energy than Joe Biden, who's often confused about where he is. Boris Johnson was set in on behalf of the US. He went into Kiev and he told Zelensky, the NATO-backed leader in Kiev, he said, you cannot sign any peace agreement with Russia. We're going to fight because we think Russia can lose. We think we can defeat Russia, that it will lose. And US weapons lobbyist / defense secretary Lloyd Austin, he admitted that the US goal is to weaken Russia. US President Joe Biden gave a speech in Poland in March 2022, and he said, that Russia cannot be allowed to have Putin in power. He said, we have to overthrow the Russian government. So how can you have peace talks with one side of the war that refuses to invite you to the table and says that they will not accept your current government? Their only proposal is you need to overthrow your government. Well, obviously, if that's the US position, it's impossible to have peace talks. So despite the fact that so many countries have been trying to push for peace, it has been the United States that has been principally the force opposed to peace. Now, in Europe, there are some countries that have flirted with the idea of peace, but at the end of the day, you know, NATO is a US-led military alliance. And increasingly in Europe, more and more people are saying that we basically have to follow what the US does. In fact, a major European think tank, which is called the European Council on Foreign Relations, it's funded by European governments. They published a policy paper over a year ago now, in which they said that the US is turning Europe into a vassal, and that Europe basically cannot have an independent foreign policy. So even if the leaders of France and Germany, for instance, which tend to be a little more independent, even if they wanted to sign a peace agreement with Russia, the US, along with the UK and some of the Eastern European countries, especially Poland, would say absolutely not. And they're the ones who continue pushing for war.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. Thank you so much for that context. And I do want to get into Europe as a vassal state or a US colony in a second, but I also want to talk about, because it seems very clear that the US is not going to win this proxy war, right? I mean, it's the old adage, like, don't go up against Russia. You know, Napoleon learned that, Hitler learned that. But as you pointed out, and as you've written in Geopolitical Economy Report, a recent post here said that China and Russia strengthen their friendship and blast Western neocolonialism and US militarism. I mean, the writing seems to be on the wall, but how far do you think the US is going to push this? I mean, are we going to find ourselves a new nuclear winter soon? Like, what do you think the situation will be?
Well, it's very concerning. Great question, Eleanor, because what we've seen just in the past few months is more and more discussion of nuclear weapons. And there was a report in Reuters, the mainstream media outlet, that the Biden administration is considering using more strategic nuclear weapons, or not using them, is setting up strategic nuclear weapons for potential use. That's very dangerous. Furthermore, NATO now is also talking about more potential deployment of nuclear weapons. The fact that they're even talking about it is extremely concerning. No one should be talking about it. I mean, this is crazy. The US and Russia have the most nuclear missiles on Earth. They could destroy the planet many times over, hundreds of times. They could destroy the entire world. So this is very concerning. And if you look at the peace proposals, the plans proposed by China and Brazil jointly, both of them have stressed the importance of the nuclear issue, opposing any discussion of nuclear weapons, calling for the end to nuclear proliferation, and also, which is another important point, saying that nuclear weapons, another important point is that nuclear energy plants should not be targets, because obviously that could be a catastrophe as well. We all know from Chernobyl, and also, in Japan as well. So this is, very dangerous, the nuclear issue. And the US has been so flippant about this. I mean, there have been some articles in the mainstream media in the US and in the UK where, so the politicians are just as crazy as in the US. There was an op-ed recently in a British newspaper saying that we should call Russia on its nuclear bluff, that Russia won't use nuclear weapons because we also have nuclear weapons. So, I mean, this is just completely irresponsible.
Yeah, absolutely. And horrifying that these people all have nuclear weapons, nuclear codes. I want to get into what you mentioned about the vassal states, because this is something that I've also been watching and discussing vis-a-vis Sweden. For those listening, I'm also Swedish. So they're called DCA agreements, and what one Swedish journalist called contempt for democracy, and said the DCA agreement reads like a capitulation document after having lost the war. Now, these are agreements that all NATO member states sign, and they're variations on a theme. But for instance, the one that Sweden has signed would give the US, now it specifically says the US, but these are NATO member states, right? Like, shouldn't it be NATO as a whole? But this just, again, proves that NATO is just an arm of US imperialism. The US would then have full access to Swedish sea, land, and airspace, along with 17 critical military bases, which doesn't sound like a lot, but Sweden's a small country, y'all. It would also have the right to add and to build up these bases where no Swedes or Swedish officials would be allowed. The US is allowed access to private land, roads, and airfields. American military and their families are above Swedish law, and not even the Swedish Secret Service are allowed to inspect homes or vehicles under suspicion of breaking the law. And it goes on from there. And Ben, I'm bringing this up firstly because, as I said, this shows the clear face of NATO as just an arm of US imperialism. But I feel that this also has something to do with why no European nation will really say boo to the US. No matter how much they destroy, like pipelines, economies, potential peace deals. So do you feel that these kind of NATO agreements are what is allowing the US to hold on to these allies in Europe in the face of an ever-growing multipolar world?
Well, that's absolutely one of the most important details. If you look at this report that was published by the European Council on Foreign Relations, this is as mainstream as it gets. They point out that one of the biggest problems in Europe is that it doesn't have any way to defend itself, and especially because the US is provoking all of these wars around the world. It's the US is safe on the other side of the world. I mean, the US is probably one of the safest countries there can be. I mean, because through settler colonialism, colonizers stole the land from indigenous peoples from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So it's very difficult. I mean, unless they think Canada is going to invade, which is never going to happen in a million years, right? It's more likely that the US invades Canada. So, I mean, obviously the US is always, in all of these conflicts, going back to World War I, World War II, and today, the US has always been safe from these wars because there's almost no fighting on US soil. Obviously, I mean, there was in Hawaii, but that's, another colonized former country that was, colonized by the US and became a state only in the 1950s, very recently. Anyway, getting back to the issue of Europe. So Europe, on the other hand, does have more serious security concerns. The US is provoking war with Russia. And if this war continues to spread, it will be Europe that actually has to fight this war while the US continues to fuel it and profit from it. So that's a huge aspect. And that's why there were some European leaders who talked about the idea of European strategic autonomy, especially when Donald Trump was president, because he's so crazy and unpredictable. Angela Merkel in Germany said we need to actually have our own independent European standing army. And French President Macron also was interested in this idea. It never really went anywhere. They constantly talk about this idea, but it doesn't really happen. And now what we see with NATO expanding and bringing in new members, we see that these countries in the region are becoming even more dependent on the US and more integrated into the US militarily. And, Sweden, a country that you're from, I mean, this is a country that also has, as you know, a history of neutrality. During the Cold War, the first Cold War, it was relatively neutral. I mean, not entirely, but at least compared to many other countries in Europe. And you even had some lefty leaders like Olof Palme, who was later assassinated because of his politics. But Olof Palme was, the best example in Europe of someone who did try to be relatively neutral. He was a friend of the Global South, of the anti-colonial movements. And in Latin America, in my experience, in fact, there are many different streets and buildings named after Olof Palme because of his role in trying to oppose these US wars and support the Global South. And that's why he was assassinated. But anyway, the point is that Sweden now is just showing that it's no longer even pretending to be neutral. You can criticize how much it actually was neutral, but it's no longer pretending and is joining this warmongering alliance. NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO destroyed Yugoslavia, which no longer exists as a country. NATO in 2011 destroyed Libya, which had been the most prosperous country in Africa. Still today, 13 years later, it has no central government. And NATO brought slavery back to the African continent. After Libya was destroyed, there were open-air slave markets. I mean, it's just horrific what's been going on. That was NATO's doing. And now, NATO has been continuously expanding under Russia's borders for decades, even going back to the former Soviet Union. We have so much evidence. This is not just hearsay. It's not just a rumor. We have evidence, for instance, that was found by a US academic from the British National Archives, minutes of a meeting in which the representatives of the US, the UK, France, and Germany, in which that was West Germany at the time, they made an agreement with the former Soviet Union in which the former Soviet Union allowed Germany to be reunified in return for the promise that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And it expanded multiple times, adding more than a dozen new members, including numerous countries that are right on Russia's borders, like, for instance, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia. And now, of course, Ukraine has said that it's going to join. This is the root of all of this conflict. Georgia, its leader is trying to join. The U.S. is blatantly meddling in Georgia's internal politics, sanctioning members of the government, the elected parliament, for not obediently following along. So, I mean, what we see in Europe also, another element of this is simply a political class that sees their future across the Atlantic. They Their ideology is Atlanticism. They believe that Europe has much more in common with the US and Canada than with anyone else. Certainly with Russia, certainly with Asia, certainly with Africa. I mean, a lot of them also have kind of racist views saying, why would we, have political and economic exchange with Africans? We should instead go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, which is much farther away than Africa or Asia. But anyway, whatever. So there's this cultural element. There's political loyalties. There's the fact that a lot of these people also have dual passports with the US. They studied in the US. Their family members study in the US. They have family members in the US like Ursula von der Leyen. So, I mean, we've seen generations of the cultivation of this relationship between Europe and the US. And it's funny because it's a love-hate relationship. Europeans rightfully love to make fun of Americans for being ignorant and whatever. But at the same time, they're completely subordinated to the US government. And finally, of course, is the economic element. The US, of course, historically, since World War II, had been the major economic power. That's changed with the rise of China, but it's still a very powerful country economically. And a lot of the elites in Europe, they have invested in US assets, US stocks and bonds. They have fancy houses, luxurious McMansions in the US. And there's all this investment that they have in the US. And as their economies in Europe are stagnating, some of the rich elites from Europe are actually going to the US, because although in the US, of course, there has been inflation, wages have been stagnant, there's more and more homelessness and poverty. If you are very rich, you can live very well in the US. I mean, very, very rich, right? You can have your mansions in your gated communities. And this is true not just for Europeans, for the elites, capitalist oligarchs all around the world. If your country has stability, if your economy is in stagnation, you can just move to the US and live in a gated community and pretend like nothing bad is happening. So essentially what we see is that the elites of Europe have sold out their people, and their golden parachute is the US. If they have to flee the country, they can all go and live in on a beach in Miami or whatever. Well, their countries, are in crisis. And we see this in many countries in Europe right now, which are entering stagnation and recession, and their governments are not actually implementing policies to try to help people. Germany entered recession, and the response of the government was more austerity, more neoliberal, dogma, which is crazy. So, and meanwhile, Germany's industry is rapidly declining. There's deindustrialization going on across Europe, and some of those jobs are going, ironically, to the US. So, the US is deindustrializing Europe. Europe is suffering the consequences of this war with Russia. And also the US is trying to start a war on China. Europe is also suffering because of that, because Europe's in many countries in Europe, their largest trading partner is not the US, it's actually China. And the US is trying to force them to commit economic suicide to try to weaken China, just as they're doing to try to weaken Russia. So Europe suffers the consequences and the US benefits. And finally, one other point. You mentioned this issue of these NATO agreements, which essentially show how the US controls NATO. Well, it's not just that. It's also that the US military industrial complex always benefits, because when a country joins NATO, part of the process of joining NATO is an idea known as interoperability. What does that mean? It means that your military hardware has to be interoperable with the US military hardware. So your military communication systems, your ammunition, and all of this have to basically be the same as US military equipment, which means huge guaranteed contracts for US weapons corporations. So Sweden and all these other countries that are joining NATO now are going to buy billions of dollars of weapons from US weapons contractors. And now more and more countries in Europe are pledging to increase military spending to 2 or even 3% of GDP. And that means that they're going to probably be spending much more on US military hardware. And of course, it's not just Biden. Let's not forget, it was Donald Trump, who supposedly is a populist and anti-establishment, which is, just complete BS. That's complete nonsense. He's never been a populist. He's a billionaire. He cut taxes on the rich. He's now calling for decreasing taxes on big corporations. And meanwhile, it was Trump who was the one pressuring Europe to increase its military spending as what NATO technically requires of these countries, 2 or 3% of military spending of GDP. So thanks to Trump, who of course also he killed 2 different peace treaties with Russia, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. And then Biden came in, and now this war went to a whole other level. So this is bipartisan, of course. The Democrats are complicit, but the Republicans are complicit as well. And it was thanks to Trump that now Europe started this process of remilitarizing that has only gotten worse under Biden.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for all of that context. I mean, it really does seem like this remarkably abusive relationship, and then that Europe just keeps taking it. I mean, it like you feel like you're watching a Lifetime movie, and you're like, just leave. You don't have to be with him. Like, just get out of this awful relationship. But it seems like, as you said, they're more interested in gated communities and being kings of a graveyard. And with that economic angle, I wanted to before we end here, I wanted to talk to you about something that was reported a few days ago and then very quickly resulted in a slew of fake news claims. And so I want to get your take on this. The petrodollar deal, or the petrodollar pact. So I was wondering if you could firstly give folks an idea of like what we're talking about when we say the petrodollar pact, but also what is your take on all of this? It's over. It's not over. We're fine. We're not going to be fine. What is going on right now with regards to that? And what does that mean for the US economy and therefore also US hegemony?
Another great question. We could spend a whole other episode talking about this. I'll try to keep it short. But before I do that, one quick thought in response to what you said, Eleanor, about the US-Europe alliance being an abusive relationship. That's absolutely right. And in this abusive relationship, we should keep in mind, of course, it's the US that benefits, but this is the US goal of trying to prevent Europe from integrating politically and economically with Asia, essentially. I mean, of course, Africa as well, which is, by the way, the fastest growing continent. It's often forgotten and not mentioned in the media. But also Asia. Economically, I mean, many economists say this is the Asian century. The 21st century is the Asian century. China is already the world's largest economy. It continues to grow faster than any other major economy. India is growing quite quickly. Indonesia is growing very quickly. Vietnam. I mean, there's so much potential in Asia. Also, a huge percentage of the world population, depending on how you measure it. I mean, like probably around half of the world population, over half of the world population is in Asia. So anyway, the point is that Europe could have much better economic possibilities by integrating with Asia. There's so much in that relationship that could be complementary. Europe has a lot of manufacturing potential, especially Germany, France to a lesser extent, Northern Italy. There's a lot of advanced manufacturing. And a lot of countries, especially in Southeast Asia that are industrializing, want more investment. Like there was a lot of German investment in China, which was part of the industrialization process. Those could be great opportunities for Europe. But instead, Europe is so wedded to the US, it's losing out on all of these economic opportunities. It's deindustrializing. And of course, Russia, the whole point of the war in Ukraine is to prevent Russia from economically and politically integrating with Europe, especially Germany. And this is the whole point of NATO. In fact, what's funny is if you go to the NATO website, you can find this famous quote, which is from Lord Ismay, who was the first ever NATO Secretary General, that is the NATO leader. And it was a British military officer who, by the way, oversaw colonial war crimes in the British colonies in Africa. But anyway, this is the first head of NATO. He had this famous quote in which he said that the point of NATO is to keep Russia out, Germany down, and the US in. So that's the idea, to keep Russia out, Germany down, to prevent Russia and Germany from becoming significant political and economic allies, because Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers and gas producers. It has huge sums of natural resources. It has tons of, minerals, everything that you would need for an industrial economy. Germany is a major industrial power, or at least it was historically. That's going away pretty quickly, in no small part because of the war in Ukraine. and Western sanctions on Russia. So that's such a complementary relationship. And if you read the famous book, The Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski, the former US imperial strategist, Zbigniew Brzezinski. In 1997, he published this book, The Grand Chessboard. And in this book, he famously said that the US must do whatever it can in order to maintain its geopolitical supremacy, is the term he used. The US must prevent Russia and Germany from forming an alliance. And the US has basically guaranteed that, and European elites have basically guaranteed that with this war in Ukraine. Now, and by extension, of course, China, because China and Russia are now very close allies. And if you integrate more with Russia, if Germany and Europe integrates more with Russia, by extension, they would integrate more with China. But anyway, that's not happening because of the war in Ukraine. This is the goal of the war in Ukraine, right? Now,
And
finally, to answer your...
wasn't one of the points of that proxy war also to destroy Russia economically? And in fact, Russia is doing better economically?
That's absolutely right. I mean, it was President Biden who said that the goal was to make the Russian ruble into rubble. And by the way, the ruble is used by Russian civilians, over 100 million Russian civilians who that's their currency. And the US said, yeah, we want to collapse their currency and collapse their economy. But they didn't do that, actually. And one of the reasons, the main reason that Russia was able to withstand these brutal sanctions is because of its economic relations with Asia. So Russia, instead of exporting, I mean, Russia's economy, it does have a lot of industrial base. It does have, other industries, but the heart of the Russian economy is fossil fuels and minerals. It's like a lot of countries, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq. These are countries that rely a lot on exporting primary products, raw materials, right? Russia is one of those countries. And instead of sending that oil and gas to Europe, it simply redirected it to China and India and even Turkey. And ironically, now Europe is buying, Europe's gas, its gas consumption has not decreased that much. Of course, we all want the world to go away from fossil fuels and move toward renewable energy as soon as possible. And by the way, China is doing that at breakneck speed. China in 2023 installed more solar panel capacity than the entire world combined. In 1 year, China installed more solar panel capacity than the US has ever installed in history. So anyway, the point is that China has the potential. The US just put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, Chinese solar panels, and Chinese batteries, which would be needed for the renewable energy transition. But the point is that regardless, that Europe, instead of decreasing its gas consumption, it's been simply buying more and more liquefied natural gas from the US, from US gas companies. So what we see is just simply a redirection of trade. The US is sending its gas to Europe, which is more expensive, and Russia is sending its cheaper gas and oil to China and India at a discount. So anyway, you're absolutely right that this is the main goal. It's to try to suffocate Russia economically, which has not worked. Because Asia, again, you cannot, the West is so, they're living this little bubble. They still believe that they control the world. It's not 1950 anymore. But anyway, getting back to your question about this is all related to the issue of the petrodollar, right? So I could spend forever talking about this. I'll briefly summarize it. So what is the petrodollar? Well, actually before World War II, but especially toward the end of World War II, the US dollar became the global reserve currency. What does that mean? It means that if you want to do trade internationally, you're probably going to invoice your trade in the dollar. And if your central bank is holding foreign currencies to try to stabilize your local currency, which are called foreign exchange reserves, the majority of that is held in dollars. And that has been the case since right before World War II in the interwar period. And then especially since 1944 at the famous Bretton Woods conference, people met in New Hampshire and Bretton Woods, and they signed this agreement in which the US dollar was officially made the global reserve currency in the international financial system, and other currencies were pegged to the US dollar. But at that time, the US dollar was set at a fixed exchange rate, which was that what that meant is that if you had $35 anywhere in the world, you could exchange those $35 for 1 ounce of gold anywhere in the world. It was a fixed rate. It was not all based on the market. And there were capital controls at the time, which today would be seen as crazy socialism, right? But This is the so-called golden age of capitalism, but actually it was very state-led capitalism. It was the Keynesian era, and there were capital controls, and capitalists could not simply move their money around and hide their money in offshore tax shelters and all this. So the point is that different currencies had a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. That changed in 1971. Why? Because the US ran out of gold because it was spending so much on its wars and on its military bases around the world, its empire, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So in 1971, US President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, which meant that you could no longer simply exchange your dollars for gold. So what that meant is that the US dollar had an issue of inflation. So in order to try to maintain the stability of the US dollar, what happened is that the US decided, instead of basing the dollar on gold, we should try to base the dollar on oil. So in 1974, just a few years after the dollar was taken off of gold, Richard Nixon sent his Treasury Secretary to Saudi Arabia to sign an agreement saying, we will protect you in Saudi Arabia and your monarchy. We will prop up an absolute monarchy, a hereditary dictatorship. And in return, you should sell your oil in dollars. At that time, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest oil producer. And it was also the leader of OPEC, the oil producing cartel. It had a lot of political and economic influence in the oil market. So by Saudi Arabia agreeing to price its oil in dollars, what that meant is that countries all around the world, if you wanted to import oil, you had to get access to dollars in order to buy that oil, right? So that meant that there was more demand for dollars around the world, because if you want to pay for oil, you have to get access to dollars. Therefore, there's more demand for dollars. Therefore, there's less inflation in the US because there's more international demand. So the US could maintain huge trade deficits for many decades. It has the world's largest trade deficit, and that is funded largely because people around the world want those dollars so they can buy oil or other commodities or products. Well, that system is changing. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is changing. And now what we don't know, there's a rumor going around that the agreement that the US signed with Saudi Arabia in June 1974 was a 50-year agreement. Now, that's not what we don't know. It is true, it's an objective fact, that the US did sign an agreement on June 8th, 1974 with Saudi Arabia. That was reported by the New York Times. What we don't know is if it was actually a 50-year agreement. That's the rumor going around. And if it was a 50-year agreement, well, Saudi Arabia did not renew it. And what we do know, what is public information, which has been confirmed, is that also in June, Saudi Arabia's central bank joined a system called mBridge. mBridge is a way of using central bank digital currencies, which, libertarians hate, but actually this is a way to try to get around US sanctions that other countries can use. And by the way, Wall Street also hates CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, because if people can have an account with the central bank, they don't need the private commercial banks. It's actually a way of like backdoor nationalization of the banks. But anyway, the point is that there's a system called mBridge, which is a central bank digital currency system that is used by China, Thailand, and the UAE. And some other countries are trying to join. Saudi Arabia has officially joined. What this means is that these countries can settle their trade imbalances using their own central bank digital currencies, and they don't need any dollars. They can not only remove the dollar, but they can remove the SWIFT system, which is the interbank messaging system based in Europe but controlled by the US, which the US uses to try to isolate countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela were kicked off of SWIFT. Well, if you don't need SWIFT and you don't need dollars if you have mBridge, and Saudi Arabia joined mBridge. So what we don't know is if Saudi Arabia will do this. Now, there have been rumors. The Wall Street Journal reported that Saudi Arabia is considering selling China oil in Chinese currency, the renminbi. And also, the United Arab Emirates has officially done transactions selling liquefied natural gas to China in renminbi, also known as yuan. So there is a precedent for this. And when President Xi of China visited Saudi Arabia in late 2022, he famously announced that China is working on trying to make agreements to buy oil and gas from the region using yuan, the Chinese currency. So, of course, we don't know. Saudi Arabia, historically has been a U.S. ally, and what it's trying to do is what many countries in the global south are doing. They're trying to play both sides to do what's in their interest, right? So one day Saudi Arabia says, we're good friends with the West. The next day we say we're good friends with the East, with China and Russia. They're playing both sides to do what's in their interest. The UAE does the same thing. Turkey does the same thing. Egypt's doing the same thing. So we'll see what happens. Saudi Arabia said that it's going to join BRICS, and then it said it's not going to join BRICS, and we still don't know if it is going to join. So it's up in the air. But I think the point that people should take away, the most important point, is that across the global south, which is the global majority, they represent over 80% of the world population, there is this feeling in the air of rebellion against imperialism. We see this with institutions like BRICS. We see this definitely in Latin America, where there are many left-wing governments in power. And we see this in Africa with these new revolutionary nationalist governments coming to power, kicking out the French, kicking out the US. And a lot of people in the global south recognize that they need to de-dollarize in order to be economically independent. Because if they still rely on the US dollar and the US banking system, they could be the next Cuba. They could be the next Venezuela. The US could try to sanction them and blockade them and detach their banks from the international financial institutions. So what we're seeing is more and more interest in creating new financial institutions. And China has been playing a big role in this. And Latin America has played a big role in this. And even longtime US allies are now hedging their bets and playing both sides. Obviously, Venezuela is very gung-ho about this. They really want to create a new financial system. But that's not surprising. But what is surprising is that even longtime US allies like Saudi Arabia are also expressing interest. And I think that really reflects the spirit of the times. We're in a very exciting moment for geopolitics, and there are so many exciting things happening. Unfortunately, that means that there are also some bad things happening. So while there are good things happening, there's the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the potential for other wars that could happen, because, of course, the US is trying to prevent the creation of a more multipolar world, which really means a more democratic world. And the US is trying to maintain a unipolar hegemonic system. And that's why we see these wars and this geopolitical uncertainty and all of these conflicts. So, that's why I want to thank you for joining me. These are the kinds of things that I report on. And it is a dangerous time, but it's also an optimistic time for a lot of people. And what this also means is for people in the US, for people in the West, with this, these political changes, it actually also opens up the possibility for more fundamental, even radical political change. Because now the bipartisan establishment consensus is breaking apart very rapidly. Unfortunately, it means that the far right is rising, but it also means that there's the possibility of real alternatives to the neoliberal establishment, real progressive alternatives that could emerge, because we see those alternatives emerging in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recent EU parliamentary elections, the far right did get several gains, but the left did as well. So I think there's definitely a powerful tug of war there, and obviously we know which side we're on. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and give us so much important context and backstory in a digestible and timely fashion. Again, you can find all of Ben's writing at his independent news site, Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, thanks again so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Eleanor, and keep up the great work.